And I would like to welcome to the speaker faculty Ed Cook, who is president of the Change Decision at the University of Richmond. Ed began his career as a naval aviator flying the C-2A Greyhound, achieving over 750 aircraft carrier landings, which is a feat in itself and worthy of praise. After leaving the active Navy, Ed worked for both Corning and Capital One as an analyst and executive. In 2007, Ed was mobilized and sent to Baghdad, Iraq, where as CDR Cook, or Commander Cook, he worked for General David Petraeus on employment initiatives and the banking system. Ed was awarded the Bronze Star. Ed is the president of the Change Decision LLC, as previously mentioned, which is a change and culture consultancy that seeks to grow joy at work by blending the science of decision analysis with the art of change management. Ed holds a PhD in decision analytics. Ed, thank you so much for joining us today. Looking forward to your presentation, and apologies for the start. Over to you.
Thank you, Brian. I'm very glad to be here and glad to get a chance to talk about a couple of my favorite things, analytics and change, as well as how that impacts culture. As Brian mentioned, thinking about that as growing joy at work. So let's go and just jump straight into what does that mean? I'll start with the joy at work part and how change implements or impacts that. And the reason I think of this as important is it doesn't matter how great a job you do as an analyst. It doesn't matter how great a job you do as you start to look at processes and make improvements on processes if you can't actually make the change happen, right? You can get whatever marvelous insight you can possibly come up with, but if you can't get people to do it, then it doesn't make for something that's going to benefit the organization. And so that's the idea of trying to connect these together, and even more so, doing it and just getting it across the finish line. So executing the change, but in the process of doing that, having everyone feel like they're beat up or bruised. People talk about the dead bodies left in the wake of the program. That all diminishes the culture, diminishes joy at work. But if it can go the other way, if you're able to do it in a way such that it elevates the culture, and when I say joy at work, I mean these 10 dimensions that you see over here on the right-hand side. And I mean this in both the rainbow and unicorn sense of joy, but also in a very analytical sense of joy. You know, Brian indicated that I have that background and I teach analytics at the University of Richmond. I want to know that something is happening and I want to be able to measure it. And that's what I want to talk to you guys about. So not just how to make the thing itself happen, make sure you understand what's going on with the change, and then ultimately have you had a positive impact on the culture? Because if you do, as you see in the little cycle I have here, then the very next change that comes along, the next process that you're trying to take a look at and make an improvement on is going to go better, because people will feel more energized around what is going on with that particular change. So what I want to focus in on then is, how do you know? How do you know how well people are progressing? And then what can you do as a person that's leading this that is reasonable, and that word is important, to make it easier for them to adopt to this new way of doing things that you have discovered through the work that you've done. And so I want to break this up into these three pieces. So I want to talk about change insights that you get from the metrics. So how do you actually know if you're progressing in a way that's going to be valuable? And then take that to a practice. Like, so what's the thing that you can actually do? And then lastly, talk about a pitfall that's always there around analytics. And it's a distinction between useful and interesting. And so we'll finish up with that, because that's really important in that it shows up for my students, whether undergrads or MBAs, as definitely shows up in the consulting work that I do, and has been present all throughout my career as an analyst. So let's start with this idea of change insights, and what does that really mean? And when I think about insights, I'm thinking about this movement from data to information to knowledge, right? So you gather a bunch of data, and by itself, it's maybe okay, but largely not useful until you analyze it and then turn it into information. And then go put that into practice and get the feedback loop to actually gain knowledge. So I look at the movement from data to information as an analytics function, and the movement from information to knowledge as an experience function. And so what we want to do is be able to set up leaders, that could be you, that could be somebody that you're working with, to be able to have conversations so that you really know what's going on as people start to implement whatever it is that you've suggested that's going to be an important change for them. And then do what you can, do what's reasonable to make it easier for them to do that. But before we dive into how we think about what's going on with metrics, we got to take on the skeptics. And I'm sure some of you guys have bumped into some of these folks that would say these things. Certainly I have again and again, so I wanted to highlight it here. But people will say that when you're talking about people implementing change, it's too inexact. And I would disagree, of course, saying that you don't need it to be exact. If you can know directionally, are people starting to implement the thing that you want them to do, then you know enough to be able to guide the change through. And people will say it's too subjective, and I would completely disagree with that. The subjective metrics are things you do want to bring in. I'm going to talk specifically about what that means and combine them with other objective metrics. And so that combination is actually far more powerful than if you're rigidly only looking at objective metrics. Talk about it being too qualitative, and again, qualitative means directional, and that is useful to bring together with quantitative metrics, which are the more specific ones, and we'll pull all that together as well. And then finally, that it's too difficult, and to be sure, you can overdo it when you're putting metrics together, and that is very important that we make sure that we scale the amount of measurement. And the way I like to think about scaling how much you're going to do is related to the risk that you potentially are trying to mitigate. And so, yeah, to go do more if the risk is larger. And if the risk is smaller, then make sure you're scaling back so you're not spending too much time or too much money trying to put together metrics that just aren't going to be valuable for what it is that you're trying to do. So what we want to do then is, if we're really going to boil change management down into just a couple things, we want to understand how people are impacted, and then we want to identify the signs is an interesting way to think about it. The signs of progress or the signs of risk, and know what they are, the ones that you really want to monitor so that you can see whether or not the behavior change that you're trying to put together based on all this wonderful work that you've done is actually happening. Because again, if the people don't do it, it doesn't matter how good of a job you did with your analysis. And so I like to think about it in these 4 basic steps and kind of guide us through those 4. So we begin with, are people engaging in the change that you've laid out? And that means basically, are they aware of the change? And what you want to ask yourself is, how will you know? Are people engaging? So what are the signs for you at that level? And then they'll move into an understand phase. So that means they're starting to understand, what does it mean to them? At the engage phase, they just know it exists. They don't even know if it's meaningful for them. The understand stage, now they're trying to understand its meaning. What does it mean to them? And are they going to have to do something different? And how much? And then test and learn. So they've internalized that, and they're starting to play with this idea, this new process, if that's the thing that you've come up with, to try and see how does it work for them? How does it come together and make something different in their lives? So they're really starting to engage with it. So they got to try it out and have it fail, learn from that, try out the next thing, fail, learn from that, move forward. So it's this constant back and forth of trying things, see what succeeds, see what fails, learn from that, and move forward until finally they adopt, right? They've got it fully engaged in what they're doing, and you've completed that process, and now it's time to go to the next one. And yeah, this is very linear, and the world's messier than that, but it's useful to have a basic construct of what you think is going on as people move through each of these. And the way to measure that is to think about it in these 3 levels. And this is kind of the key work, key part that I would want you to take on board. I'm going to dive into this here in just a second, but let me give you an overview of it to start. If I'm thinking about metrics that are about people and about people doing something different, then I would want to have these 3 levels of metrics. So first, the self-reported. This is very typical for a change management effort. Put out a survey, ask people about their readiness for the change is the word that's typically used. The core of that data is subjective, right? That you're asking somebody, how do they feel? Only I know how I feel, right? I can't know how you feel. You can't know how I feel because it's subjective. By definition of that word, it's about the subject, me, and only I can know what I feel. Now you may see outward signs. I may say I feel fine, and you may look at my face and go, it doesn't look like he feels fine. But that's because you're observing an outward view. You don't know what's inside my head or how I'm thinking about it. But through a survey, we can then collect that data and convert that subjective data into at least qualitative data, potentially quantitative data. Then we want to move to the observables. So what do you see objectively? Now we're in objective data. And so objective data means I see it and you see it, and we can say the same thing about it. So we're able to, at this level, make qualitative judgment. This is qualitative data, which means it's comparative. So it's nearer or farther, bigger or smaller, taller or shorter. We can make those kinds of comparisons, and humans are very good at this, right? We'll get it right most of the time. It seems like this is happening more often, and others would observe the same thing and say the same about it. They would hear questions about it and say, I hear these kinds of questions more often. And we would agree that that's going on. That is going to be qualitative data, which is part of an objective group of data. And then lastly, existing metrics, right? So there's some reason that you're doing this work, right? There's something that you want the company or organization to improve upon. And that's why we are trying to do this. Maybe your easy ones are increasing revenue or decreasing costs, but there are many, as I'm sure all of you are aware, underneath all of that you might go after. And understanding what those existing metrics are and bringing them into this entire view of what's happening with the change are going to give you a fuller view. So it's these three together: self-reported, observable, and existing metrics that come together to give you the insights that are actually going to drive action. So let's understand then, how do we go about really understanding this progress, right? So we want to know, is this change working? We put all this stuff together. How do we know that we're going to get anywhere? And so let's just do it as an example, right? So we'll imagine that we have a software development company and we're trying to put together a community of practice. And it doesn't even matter what that's about, but that's the idea. We're trying to make a change that's going to drive a group of people together into a community of practice. And so I want to put together some metrics that let me know, am I making progress on developing that community of practice? Am I getting the change that I actually want? So one of the first things I might do then is I might start with a survey. And so in Q1, I ask them this question: I understand how the community of practice supports a best-in-class discipline at the ABC software company. And in Q1, I get 60% that say yes. And what I'm measuring is the percentage of people that report the top two boxes, that in a Likert scale, that strongly agree and agree, or the top two boxes. That's what I'm paying attention to here. I get 60% in Q1, and I get 30% in Q2. And so I might be freaking out that as I'm progressing through time, the numbers are going down. That might be a sign that I'm worried about. But what I would suggest is that's incomplete. You don't know enough about what is going on to be able to make that inference. You need those other two measures to be able to do that. So this self-reported is good, but we also want to move on to some observable metrics. So we want to see what we observe. So let's say we want to measure something like, just, are people sharing the community practice resources with each other on Slack or Teams or whatever it is that the organization is using? And we're just going to take a look at that. And we could do it as a full-on metric, as a percentage, or we could just do it as an observable. You get together with people in a regular meeting to check on the progress of this community of practice, and just ask people, what do you observe? People doing this more often? Are they sharing it more than they used to? And you can look at it from 2 points of view, like literally look at it, which is what I'm depicting on the left, And then thinking about those 4 phases. Are people aware of what's going on? Do they understand how it impacts? Are they starting to try it out, to test and learn? And then finally, have they adopted? And what do you observe with that? Seeing how people are sharing things about the community of practice on something like Slack or Teams could be an indication of that. But then also, what sort of questions are people asking? Are they asking, hey, when's this happening kind of questions? Those are getting engaged kind of questions. Are they asking, what will I have to do differently? That's an understand kind of a question. They're starting to ask questions about, hey, when's training available? How do I play around with this thing? Is there a resource area that I can get into and start to use some of the tools? That's going to be a test and learn. And then are they asking business as usual questions? When's the next happy hour? That's a good business as usual question. So have they finished with the change and are they back to normal with this thing? And so we're on and ready to take on the next thing. So that could be the series of observable sorts of metrics that we would want to take on. And it's best to think about those qualitatively or comparatively, if that's a better way to think about it. Are we getting more of that or less of that? So maybe we saw in Q1 this dip from people's understanding about the community of practice, but we've seen an increase in the amount of resources being shared. So those might be counter to each other as you start to think about that. But you could start to create a story about what might be going on that you can then test. Maybe people are starting to get into it. They're trying things out. And as a result of trying things out, they don't feel as comfortable with it because they're learning. And so that may be an indicator that you are actually moving through these 4 phases. People are now in test and learn, and it's a little choppy when they're trying to understand what's going on. And then lastly, with existing metrics, starting to look at what is really going on with the core company numbers that give an indication for how well the company is doing. So we might look at the people on the community practice portal that are now using those resources as part of their regular work. And that could be a straight up, what percentage of people are actually in the portal and they're downloading things. That might be a metric you would go after. I'm giving you a few others that you might also pay attention to as the ones as an indicator that something good is going on, or if they're going the opposite direction, something bad is going on. So in Q1, on the left-hand side, you see things like how engaged are people, how many presentations are happening, how many products are covered by our community of practice. And some of those numbers are going up as we move to Q2. Not all, but in general, they're going up. And as we look in the middle, we see that attrition is starting to come down. And our recruiting has come up a bit. So word maybe has started to get out there that we are developing an expertise in our company around this particular area, and that's having an impact on the kinds of people that want to come and hang out with our company and the sort of people that want to stay. And so you get that idea of what are those basic metrics that tell you, what are the signs that tell you that you're making progress on all of this. So if we were to pull all this together, just to give you some examples, for the self-reported things, you might get surveys that talk about, I understand what's going on here, or feedback that you might get from a focus group, or even candidates coming in saying, hey, yeah, this is my #1 choice of company. And people are self-reporting about what's happening with that. And you might pull those together. If you look at observable metrics, you might see that what managers see, what around the processes that are being used, the questions that they hear about the tools, even responses that you get from interviewees about the role, and the increase or decrease of those might be important. And then lastly, existing metrics. So whatever those things are, percentage of people that are downloading the resources, retention and attrition rates, even things like engagement scores that might be more of an indicator about the culture. Pulling that grouping together, and it doesn't need to be a lot. It can be just a handful of metrics, and talk a little bit about how do you know you got the right number of metrics when we get a little further in. But the idea here is to have the ones that are telling you what's going on, that give you the signs about what is really happening here, so that you know whether or not you're making progress or not. And that takes you over to this idea of actionable insights. And that actionable is really important. Brian mentioned at the beginning of this thing that my PhD area is in decision analytics. Like I think of the world as decisions and changes. So first you make decisions about things, and then you got to go implement the change. So why do you go about putting any metrics together ever? Is so that you can go and make a decision about it. So I want to get to something that's actionable, that I actually go do something about. So I want to think about what changes are going on in these existing metrics and the self-reported channels that are noticeable, and what behaviors are we seeing as well. And then is there a theme? Something start to stand out for me. And in addition to that, do I see any risks that I need to take on? And the last one is the money question. What actions could we take to reinforce progress? So even just like walking your way through those 5 questions based on this data, and finally getting to what's the thing that I can now go do, that's the thing that's going to drive the success of the change. But you guys are into information and into measurement and understanding these kinds of things, and so you also know that things live in distributions. So everything doesn't happen all at once. They tend to be distributed, and there are many models for this, but they're generally some sort of a normal distribution, as I'm showing you here. So if we're imagining putting this thing out over 4 quarters, we don't actually have everybody walk through and engage at the same time, understand, test and learn, and adopt. What actually happens is that people get spread out across this distribution, in this case through time, of when they start to engage. And so we do get a portion at the very beginning who probably do come through relatively rapidly and adopt pretty early, and another group at the opposite end that won't engage for quite a while until they really see that others have, and then are the last ones to finally adopt, and then the bulk of the people that are somewhere in the middle. So part of what you might want to do as you start to think about these things is recognize that that is a pattern that is repeated many, many times in both the business world, the natural world. There's a reason that we spend a lot of time paying attention to a normal distribution when we talk about analytics. And so noticing that you're likely to move through and the change is likely to move through across a normal distribution can be useful when you start to think about what are the levels that I'm looking for in each of these metrics. So the bottom line of that is don't set the metric at the top level of what you want to see to know that you're done. That's fine when you're all the way on the right-hand side and you get to adoption. Think about what will tell you that you're moving through these various phases and you're getting the early adopters in, and then the 2 components of the majority, and then finally, where are you with the laggards? And think about what those levels are for those metrics so that you know whether or not you're on the right path or not, because it's not going to happen all at once, and it's not going to be a linear process, or at least not very often. So the last part that I wanted to get into is this idea of metrics testing, which is really, how do you know that you got the right metrics? And the way to think about that broadly is to think about, do I have interesting metrics or useful metrics? And I'm going to encourage you to get to useful metrics. People get to interesting metrics all the time. You see something that's there and you go, wow, that's interesting. Literally, people will say, wow, that's interesting. But is it useful? And the way to know if it's useful is, are you going to do anything with it? Are you going to make a decision and then execute a change against that decision? And if you're not, then it's interesting and not useful. And I would suggest eliminating the interesting metric from how you're contemplating this work, because it's just driving cost. You're spending money, time, energy to go and do the collection of that data and then look at it, but you're not going to make a decision based on that information. So it's not helping you. So it might be fun or interesting, but it's not going to be useful. So how do you get there? Well, the way in which suggests that you think about getting there is this broad notion of a pre-mortem exercise. So that's what we're trying to get to, a pre-mortem exercise. I'll talk more about that, but it's start at the beginning, and in the selection of the metrics, how do you go about doing it? And people often make decisions backwards. And so this is set up to try and get you to do it in a different way. And what I mean by backwards is that people make decisions starting off with what are the possible things to select, what I would call the alternatives. What I'm going to suggest you do instead is think about what you value, or what are the ways in which you're going to evaluate whether or not a particular option is the right option or not. So I'll give you my somewhat trivial example, but I think it'll land well because this seems to be true for so many people. If I'm going to go to dinner with my wife, and we start off and go, hey, where do you want to go to dinner? And we throw out restaurants. And I throw a couple out, and she says no. She throws a couple out, and I say no. And we kind of go round and round with this. And what here is this happens all the time for other people as well. Well, why is that? Well, if what she wants to do is to sit outside at a casual restaurant, and what I want to do is to be at some fancy Italian restaurant with white tablecloths and silverware, every time I throw out a fancy restaurant that's inside, she's going to say no because what she values is being outside. And every time she throws out a casual restaurant, I'm going to say no because I'm expecting to go to a fancy restaurant. And we can do that for a while because neither of us has any idea what the criteria is that the other is using to pick. So we could throw out alternatives and never ever get there. Eventually we will, but take a while to get there. So instead, and you may all laugh, we go the other way and we talk first about, okay, what do you care about? Hey, I want to sit outside, or I want to go to a restaurant that looks like this, and then go and make a decision from there. And so I would suggest that you do something exactly like that. Start off with, what do you care about? What do you want to see happen as you think about this change that you're trying to put in place based on the information that you've gathered so far? So determine what you value. And then now brainstorm all the metrics that might tell you that. And I do mean all, as many as you can come up with, that's fine. Try and be as expansive as you can. And then from there, narrow down. And the way in which I'd have you narrow down is by testing the impact. That's this part that's here in the middle. So how can you do that? Well, look at each of the metrics and consider what a realistic high value is and a realistic low value is. So let's just take something that's relatively straightforward, like attrition. And let's say you've typically had a 3% annual attrition rate. So it's unlikely that you're going to go up to 100% attrition, right? Every single person leaves a company, even though technically the scale could go that high. That's probably not the most likely high value that you're going to get to. So after some discussion, you're like, well, I'm pretty sure it's not going to get higher than 5 or 6%. Pick whatever that number is. Same thing on the low end. It's not likely that your attrition goes all the way to 0. It might get pretty low, but it's probably not going to 0. So come up with what you think those likely values are, and then what the most likely value, the middle value is that you're expecting to get. And now go through this thought experiment. Given those values, what would you do if you actually hit the extremes? So if you think, okay, attrition seems like something I want to pay attention to here, and you pick 6%, and you say, let's say attrition went up to 6%, would we do anything? And if the answer is no, then that metric may not be very valuable for you, because you're not going to do anything. You're not going to make a decision or take action by the value that that metric hits. So it might be interesting to know that attrition has come up to 6%, but it's not useful. Same at the other end, like attrition drops all the way down to the bottom and you go 0.5 percentage point. I mean, maybe you'll celebrate and go, hooray for us, we have a low attrition rate. But if you're not really going to do anything else, then that value may not be doing anything useful. So I would suggest taking that metric out of the grouping that you have, and do that for all of your metrics. So given what you know, if you hit those values, would you do something? And if you would, then that might be a useful metric to have to track. And the last piece of that within this middle section here is just check and see, do you have metrics that are essentially measuring the same thing? And that happens all the time. And then just pick which is of that group you have. Maybe you've got 3 or 4. Just take one of them, because you're trying to skinny down to just the number of metrics that are going to be useful for this particular change. And then the last part of that is determine what that action actually is. So if you do get to the extremes, what is the action? And this is the idea of the pre-mortem. So you start to imagine, what are all the failure mechanisms? So if a post-mortem is to look backwards and understand what the failure mechanisms actually were, a pre-mortem is to look forwards in time and imagine what those failure mechanisms are. And now put metrics in place that tell you if those things are starting to happen, and then think through what are the actions that you want to take in order to correct whatever's going on. And you want to do that now, before you've gotten there, while things are calm and it's easy to pull all of that together, and not get there in the heat of battle, right? So another example from my aviation career, we practiced the emergency procedures again and again. So we knew exactly what we were supposed to do if the bad thing ever happened in the aircraft, because you don't want to try and figure that out while the plane is literally on fire. And so same thing in the business context as well, hopefully not quite as dire, but the idea would be, can you figure all of that out ahead of time so that when it does happen, you go, okay, team, we're now going to execute the plan that we put together because we are seeing the metrics get to wherever they are. And that will be immensely valuable for you if you've got that all pulled together. So when I think about that, if I was going to pull something together, I might get a metric sheet that looks something like this. I've thought through my phases: adopt, test and learn, understand. I've got all of those together. I've thought through what kinds are they: self-reported, observable, existing metrics. Actually came up with the metric and how I got it. And I've looked at the values. What are the high values and the low values? What do I think my likely in the middle value is? So I have an understanding of what those are. And you don't necessarily need to have one from self-reported, one from observable, one for existing for all 4 of the phases, but it's a good place to start. It's a place to drive your thinking and really imagine what those could be, because it'll help you to spread your view out broader than you likely would otherwise. And you'll get a better sense of what the metrics actually could be as a result of that. And it'll give you a better complete metric set as you pull all of those together.
So this is Jim. We're getting close to the hour. If you could wrap up, and we'll take some questions. Thank you.
Happy to. So let me just go here to the end slide then. So if we're thinking about the what I want you to think through with all of this, what are the metrics that you really want to have? Think about a multi-layered approach, and then test them. Test all of those metrics out so that you're able to pull all of those pieces together. All right, I will stop there then, and let's see what kind of questions we got.
Thanks, Ed. Fantastic talk. Very near and dear to my heart, as some of the folks that are on the line know. We talk about this all the time. How many metrics is too many metrics? And how do you narrow down to those few that you really need to choose to drive your company? We're always overwhelmed with metrics, and I think that's always the question. And our leaders and our companies are just going crazy, going, what metrics do we want to focus on? We make it too simple, then we drive negative behavior. We make it too complex and try to abide by everybody's wants and needs. It's too wishy-washy. So how do you, when you're bringing on a client and you're looking at, okay, how do we do this in the shortest amount of time? Because nobody has any time anymore, as we know. I don't know anybody has any time extra anymore. How do you sell this, and how long does it take to gain that alignment? And then how do you use, and the second question I see is, how do we use process mining data to help us in this process and link the qualitative to the quantitative?
Yeah, so let me try and do the selling part of that first. So the phrase that seemed to land well with people is, what are the signs that are going to tell you that this is going well? And for most people, that seems to land with them as a surprise. Like, they haven't really thought about it like that. So like, how will you know this is any good? What will tell you that? And I'll usually get almost always kind of a sit back, pause for a second as they try and take that on. But then guiding them through that sort of conversation. And what I've seen is that that is highly scalable, meaning it might be one thing or two things that are the signs. Like, if I can see this, I know we're good. I'm like, okay, well, great. Let's just measure that. Then there's no point in measuring all this other stuff if all you really care about is this, if that's the thing that's going to tell you that it's there. Now, that's probably for a smaller initiative, but that can scale all the way to a $70 million massive infrastructure process policy change. There's just going to be a lot of signs, and they're probably for various different groups that you have. And now I would walk through all of those. So the scaling part of this, I think, is really important. I would say my initial introduction to the idea of change management did not go very well at all, because I was one of those leaders, and the change person's coming in saying, here are all these templates, we need to fill all of these out. I'm like, no, we're not. I'm not doing that. Right. I don't have to, just as you said, Jim, I don't have time to do that. I'm trying to lead this big giant effort over here. I can't take the energy, and I'm not even sure what I get out of it. So I might be convinced to do it if I was really sure that I was going to get something good, but I don't know that, and so I'm not going to try it out. So even in the consulting, as sort of a subset of that, try and find one pain point that's there that I can take care of. Because even if I could do something small and demonstrate that this is valuable and provides an insight that you can now make a decision on, and I get rid of this headache that the leader's got, that is like the winning entry into what's going on. So it allows people to be able to try it out and feel a little bit more comfortable about that. So that's how I think about it. What are the signs that tell you what's going on?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the data that you get as you start to think about process mining and really understanding what's there, that for me fits in, exactly into what's going on here, because that is some no kidding quantitative data to tell you if is it going the way you want it to go or not, right? So I can actually look at what's happening with whatever's going on with the process and be able to say, is it happening in the way that we want it to happen? Now that is likely a lagging metric, right? So I start to see that when it's going well. What I also want to be able to see is what are the right things happening to lead into that, and this is some of the change part that's there. So I'll just make it up. So we'll come up with a change that we want to have into a process, and in order to do that, something easy, people have to at least go and engage with some sort of a training that we've done or get into a sandbox and try something out, right? So I want to at least know that they've done that. They're actually engaging with the system. That might be at the very beginning of the phase. So the process isn't getting any better yet. People are just starting to learn what to do. And then I might see them, if they have to take a test or a quiz or something like that, then I see if those scores are any good. Or maybe I ask the managers, do you think your people are smarter about this process or not? Do you observe that that's happening? And so I set those up so then the final metrics, the more quantitative ones that I would get as I'm looking at a process, that would be the ones that actually are telling me that I'm really getting what I want to get to. But if I only looked at those, then I might not understand what the entire flow is that's coming through, because I would think of those as lagging metrics, and I want to see the leading metrics that are telling me people are starting to do stuff that's going to produce the lagging metric outcome.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dr. Cook. Appreciate your insights to change management, one of my passions, and I think a lot of ours. And in today's world, it's really hard to get management to embrace change management. It seems harder now than it was ever before. Yeah. And I think we need it more than we've ever needed it before. And I think your approach is very easy. It's not so onerous as some of those other change management approaches. As you said, you got to fill out this template and do this and do that. I like your approach. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. If you have any questions, please do reach out to Ed directly. And we look forward to seeing you're going to share the presentation, of course. with everyone.
Sure.
And we look forward to that. So thank you, Ed. And
Thank you.
with that, we'll get ready for our next presenter at the top of the hour. So if Ed, you would let your screen go. Thank you.
I won't let go.
Okay, thanks so much, Ed.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So at the top of the hour, we will have James Henderson coming up with an exciting presentation on process mining. He'll look at leveraging process intelligence for not only process improvement, but for operationalizing change. So we'll see you at the top of the hour. Thanks so much, and see you in a few minutes. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.